We continue looking at how the economy is impacted, especially how you and I can come out of this. Earlier on, we spoke to political and social commentator Mkoni Rachutanga, who was saying in a recovery plan, South Africa has to put the principle of self and collective self-reliance. Now, public, private and social sector leaders are taking some measures to manage the fast-evolving crisis of jobs and work. But there is room for a need for greater focus, speed, boldness and innovation. But how do we rebuild and reimagine jobs amid this coronavirus crisis? Businessman and motivational speaker Vusi Thembekwayo joins us now for more. A very good evening to you, Mr. Thembekwayo. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps as a businessman, I need to ask you first, how have you been able to contend with these circumstances? Are you able to stay afloat? Have you had to pivot your businesses?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting time. We are staying afloat, but admittedly with great difficulty. So for our venture capital firm where we're invested in businesses, there have been challenges around making sure that those businesses are liquid, making sure that those balance sheets can withstand this period. And of course, the difficulty around the extensions of this lockdown and now the phased approach means that every plan you have needs to change every single time the scenario changes. So that's been difficult. Coincidentally, for my public speaking business, I was supposed to be on tour. So I had a European and a US tour coming up, and I've had to cancel those dates. So even internally for ourselves in the business, we're now really looking hard at what are the opportunities at the moment. And in fact, just this week, I've got some webinars lined up with international clients. So we've indeed had to pivot our business.
And it's interesting that you talk about that, because some of the measures that people are suggesting is rapidly building online talent exchanges to create not only transparency, but on-job openings and facilitate redeployment. Is that, I mean, that's the ideal, but how easy is it?
So, I mean, I think that's a great idea. There are some platforms like that already exist. So there's TaskRabbit, there's Upwork, there's several global platforms where talent moves away from the permanent employment scenario into a more task-based or project scenario, kind of what is the freelancing world. Admittedly, it's difficult for an industrialized economy, so you can't really do that for a factory, say. And I think that's going to be the challenge of the future. I think what South Africa has to decide is, what does the South African economy look like going forward? This is a fundamental rethink of everything we've thought about in terms of what makes up our economy. What is the contribution of labor versus automation? A big conversation we need to have. What's the role that our financial system plays? Because I'm baffled at why the financial system has kind of been allowed to carry on and continue debiting people's accounts when everybody else is not allowed to work. So I do think that there's going to be, and there needs to be, a fundamental rethink in how we put together the South African pact of what our economy looks like.
Now, some people are speaking of reskilling at speed and at scale. It's problematic if you don't have requisite skills for this economy, or the one that we were in previously to begin with. And we've been showing in our pictures, we spoke earlier on with another HR expert about the informal sector. So how would you encourage somebody who's sitting at home, who hasn't even had a job for 5 years to begin with?
And I think that's the biggest difficulty, right? I think the biggest difficulty of the moment is that we're actually in an attrition of jobs with people who already have skills and who are already in the labor market. And in addition to that, we've got people who are unemployed. And in addition to this, we have people who are going to join the queue of unemployment. Just today, it came out that Emirates is considering cutting 30,000 jobs. And that's just Emirates alone in terms of what's happening in the aviation space. So clearly, there's a big rethink there. I think the best piece of advice for any person watching this conversation, thinking about their own jobs and their own future and what that means, is simply to stop thinking about the job and actually to start thinking about the value. Now, so I've been saying this for the past 10 years, and I've been slated for saying it. But South Africa's problem was we focused on job creation, not value creation. If you create economic value, as a consequence, jobs would result. It's not a linear system, so it's not a one-to-one program, but it does create that opportunity. So if you're a young person watching this conversation, or you're a person who's unemployed, the real question for you to ask is, where is there that you can participate in? Where's the economy going? What are the sectors that are growing? And how can you become a part of that system? Because if you add value to the system, you become employable. And that's an easier lot than simply looking for the job, which is kind of the way things were in the past.
And we don't want to be dependent on the state or government, business associations. But how would these entities, though, incentivize others to be able to provide that value, or at least attract it?
Yeah, great question. So I think our state definitely has to rethink its program around deployment of capital to enable business to create these entities. It definitely has to rethink it. The way we've been doing it clearly doesn't work and hasn't worked to the best of what we need done. I think what the state needs to do is to have a program, a very clear program, in terms of what sectors of the economy do we want to develop. Now, I wrote an article about this, which was featured on Bloomberg, talking about the lessons that South Africa can learn from Bangalore, or what I call Silicon Bangalore. And what India, in effect, did is it didn't try to build an economy that was an industrialized economy and a technological economy and a financial economy. They just went, we're going to build a technological economy. They became really, really good at one key component of contributing to the rest of the world. China did it in terms of manufacturing. Now it's Vietnam in terms of manufacturing. So what we really have to think about as South Africa is, when you think South Africa, what is the one thing we must be number one in the world at? If we get that right, then we can build an entire value chain and integrate that value chain into the rest of the world. That's, I think, the first point. The second point is, I think South Africa's big businesses really have to rethink the economic value they bring to the country, but also the social value that they bring to the country. Because this idea of big firms being built in, industrial areas and selling goods and products into townships, and never really thinking about how do they include the townships and the consumer markets in their production system or in their value chain, that's old, it's dead, and South Africans have to insist that big businesses must rethink that.
And it's very interesting that you should say that, Mr. Thembekwayo, because I'm thinking we've been saying how small businesses or micro businesses are most at risk. And in order to come out of this, building alliances is something that's also being flagged as something that could help alleviate the problem. In a capitalistic society, though, one can hardly imagine how that's going to happen and how those big corporates won't cannibalize the micro businesses.
110%. And by the way, that's kind of where we've been. So if you think about, and I'll give you a great example, Sepiso. If you think about fintech, which was a buzz for 3 or 4 years. But what happened with many of the small fintech players is the minute they reached critical scales, the large groups bought them. The big insurance companies bought them. The big banks bought them. So you have to, as a government, again, set the agenda that you need to have disruptive businesses that are going to create a new normal. The way things are just isn't normal. South Africa has 55 million citizens. We have the largest middle class in the continent, bar Nigeria, depending on how you define the idea of middle class. But that notwithstanding, Kenya, which is a middle class, a quarter the size of ours, has 44 banks. We've got 4. 5 if you want to really broaden the definition of what is a mainstream big bank. And it's not just banking. It's true too for retail. Look at what's happening in clothing retail. There may be 5 large clothing retail companies. There's 6 large mining houses, and it's pervasive in every single sector you look. You've got these large oligopolies that control access into that ecosystem and into that market. South Africa's government and political party has to now realize that transformation is not buying shares in these big businesses. We've done it for a quarter of a century and it didn't work. And we know it doesn't work because our people are still in the townships, still poor, still unemployed. No job, no income, no assets, what they call the ninja generation. That's still the case. So the only way we're going to do it is if we broaden economic participation and get more players in the boat. Just a quick last note for you. Even the Reserve Bank, as conservative as they are, published a study now 2 weeks ago conceding that the South African banking environment is completely not competitive. So the fact that you have middle class people talking about not being able to afford access to credit or access to buy an asset, it's precisely precisely because of the structure of the banking system. And it's not just banking, I'm saying, it's in every single sector. We have to insist on a new normal. We have to broaden economic participation. You have to bring in small businesses. You have to industrialize the townships. And you have to enable people the opportunity to compete in this new economy. Anything short of that, and we're not going to survive what's coming at the back end of this.
Good that you mentioned Kenya, because we're going to draw the interconnectedness of the continent. There is a concert that's going to start any moment now. That is hip-hop artist Giuliani has joined forces with Kenya Fight Inequality to highlight the level of inequality there, which is something that the world, the continent contends with. Thank you very much for your time, and Insights businessman and motivational speaker Vusi Thembekwayo.